What's up everyone, this is the last video in this series, and in this video we're going to talk about how we can include different images on our website as well as arranging data using tables. Please subscribe to my channel and leave a like if you enjoyed this type of content, and let's jump into coding. I'll see you in a second. Alright, welcome to the last portion of HTML tutorial. We're going to be learning about images and tables. And before we start, go ahead and create an empty HTML file and pre-fill it with some boilerplate code. And if you remember how to do it in VS Code, go ahead and type in exclamation mark and hit enter. And it will create your HTML element as well as head and body. And the first element we're going to talk about is going to be image element. So let's go ahead and create an image element by using img tag. And there are several attributes that we need for that. And the first one is going to be src attribute. And what I want you to do is go ahead and find an image on the internet. So we are going to be using that tree image, right click on it, hit open image in a new tab, and take a look at that. So this image has a URL associated with that. Go ahead and copy that URL, go back to our code and paste that URL inside of the source attribute and hit save. Now let's open up our web page and hit refresh. And now you see that this image is actually getting embedded inside of our HTML. So whenever you specify that source attribute, what HTML is going to do, or what your browser is going to do, is it will basically grab that image located at this address and paste it on your website. Now let's go ahead and talk about the second attribute, which is going to be alt attribute. So an alt attribute is basically an alternative description for that image. So let's say that someone takes down the image that we're currently using, or we have that mistyped, the URL is mistyped, incorrect URL. So basically what the browser is going to do, it will instead display this alternative tag. So let's go ahead and give the description for that image. And we can say tree on a sunset. Perfect, let's refresh the browser, and right now nothing is actually getting displayed. But what if we go ahead and change the URL, we make a typo in the URL, save the file, hit refresh, and notice right now, since the URL is incorrect, browser fails to get that image, and instead the browser will display the alternative description for that image. So let's go ahead and undo the change that we made by pressing Command Z or Control Z if you're on Windows, save the file, refresh the page once again, and we get the image back. But I don't like the sizing of that image, so let's reduce it. And the way that we can do that is by providing two attributes called width and height. So we're going to be using the width and height attributes to change the width and height of the image respectively. So let's go ahead and type in 100 for the height and 100 for the width. Save the file, refresh the page. Notice our image shrank down a lot, and the numbers that you provide to the width and height attributes are pixels. So right now this image is 100 by 100 pixels. Let's experiment with that. What if we change the height to be 300? Save the file, refresh the page. Notice our image is now stretched out. So it's basically more height than there is width. So why is that? So when you specify the width of 100 pixels and the height of the 300 pixels, what browsers will try to do is that they will stretch the image based on those dimensions. So what is happening is you're basically messing up the aspect ratio of the image. So what I want you to do is go ahead and remove the height attribute, and we'll see what happens in that case. Go ahead and refresh the page, and let's actually make the width bigger. We'll make it 300. Go ahead and refresh the page, and you will notice that right now the width of the image is 300 pixels, but the height is going to be automatically adjusted based on the original aspect ratio of the image. So in order to preserve the original aspect ratio of the image, what you can do is you can actually omit one of those values. And we can go ahead and try to remove the width attribute and keep the height attribute in place and see what happens in that case. Go ahead and refresh the page. And notice right now the height is 300 pixels and now the width is much bigger because the original aspect ratio is preserved. So that's it for an image element. An image element is going to be represented by the img tag, which is going to be a self-closing tag. Notice we don't have a closing pair. We need to have the source attribute, which is going to specify the location of an image, An alt attribute is going to specify an alternative description of an image, and if you want to change the dimensions of the image, you can use the height and width attributes. So let's go ahead and remove that image element. We're not going to be using that anymore. And let's move on to tables. And in HTML, in order to create a table, we use a table element. So let's go ahead and start filling in some rows for our table. And the way that we do it in HTML is we have a special element called table row element. And each row inside of the table needs to have some data. So if you think of the Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets, you have rows, you have columns, and you have those cells. So the way that we represent those cells is by using the TD element, which stands for table data cell. So go ahead and enter some value for that cell, and I'm going to be using apples as an example. And for the next cell, we're going to be using quantity of apples, let's say 100. Save the file and refresh the page and see how it looks like. So basically, we've created a row inside of the table. So go ahead and copy that table row and paste it below. Let's create another row. And instead of apples, we're going to be using bananas. Save the file, refresh the page. And now we have another row with bananas. But just by looking at the table, we can't really tell what these columns represent. So the way that we can fix that is by introducing the new element, which is called TH. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a new table row above everything else. And inside of the table row, let's create the TH element. And here we're going to put items for the first one, and we're going to put quantity for the second one. Let's go ahead and save it and refresh the page. So one thing that you might notice, let me zoom in, is when you create that TH element, it basically puts the content inside of it in bold. So what the TH element does is it basically defines the header for the whole column, the title for the whole column. So now, by looking at the table, we know that the first column is going to be items and the second column is going to be quantity. Let's actually clean our code a bit. We're going to remove those extra spaces because we don't really need them. TH could be on one single line. And let's do that the same for the quantity. Go ahead and save it, refresh the page, and there will be no difference. Let's go ahead and talk about a couple other optional elements that we have. The first one is going to be the T head, and the T head is pretty much going to stand for the table head. So it's going to define the header for our table. Let's go ahead and move our row that defines all the titles for our columns inside of the table head. And let's remove line 12, save the file, and refresh the page. So visually, it doesn't really do anything. Basically, what it does is it just defines one or multiple rows, depending on your table, that are going to specify the header for the table. And another element is going to be the table body. So let's go ahead and define it. We're going to be using the tBody tag for that. And basically what it does is it defines the body of the table. So what we can do is we can actually move the whole content inside of the tBody, and the tBody is going to represent the actual content of that table. Let's go ahead and save it and refresh the page. And once again, visually it doesn't really do anything, but it helps us distinguish between which rows are actually the header and which rows are actually body of the table. And the last element that I want to mention is going to be the caption element. So we're going to be using the caption element to actually represent the title for the table. And the title is going to be all items in this case. It doesn't really matter. Let's just see what it looks like. Go ahead and save the file and refresh the page. And now what we can see is it actually creates that title for our table. So now we have the title, we have the header, and we have the body for the table. One thing that I'd like to mention is if you add more table data for rows, table element is actually quite flexible. It will not actually screw everything up. It will pretty much just add more columns to your table, and it will still preserve the original values in their original columns. And that's it for our tables in HTML. So in order to create a table, you can use the table element, and then you can use an optional caption element to create a title for the table. Then you can provide an optional T-head element, which is pretty much going to define a set of rows that belong to the header of the table. And in order to create a row, you use the TR element, which stands for table row, and then you can create titles inside of the table row to actually specify the name for the columns, and for that you use the TH elements. Then you can create the tBody element, and tBody is basically going to specify a set of rows that will actually define data inside of our tables. And they're also going to be represented by rows, and actual table cells are going to be represented by the td element. So that's going to be it for that video, and thank you for sticking around, and I'll catch you later.